Welcome to Area 8 of areas of the AICP certification exam content outline video overview guide. This is for the major topic area on areas of practice. This is part 3 of 3 for this major area, meaning there are two other videos that cover various of the 19 separate elements of this Roman numeral of the outline. My name is Jordan Yin. I'm a faculty member in Urban and Regional Planning at Alabama A&M University in Huntsville, a longtime AICP member and volunteer, and also the author of Urban Planning for Dummies. Joining me today are two former students who are successful AICP members, Luis Will Balderrama and Aaron Tidwell, and I will let them introduce themselves. Will?
Hello, everyone. Like Dr. Ian said, on the screen it says Louis Balderrama, but I like to go by Will. Um, I am a military planner at Pond. I recently took the AICP exam 2 years ago. It was a very big exam, very time consuming. Put a lot of effort into it. Glad to say I finally passed.
Fantastic. Aaron?
My name is Erin Tidwell, and I'm the city planner with the city of Athens, Alabama, located in northern Alabama. And I took the AICP exam a little bit more recently in May of 2024, and I passed as well. But I graduated from Alabama A&M, where I met Dr. Yin, but I graduated in 2020. So I probably should have took the exam a little bit sooner, but it took me a little while to study and find the right time to take it, but I'm glad I finally did.
Well, I'm glad that both of you did too, and you're both very recent test takers. I think I think you've both taken the current version of the exam. And also, it also does reflect some of the changes they've made to eligibility, which has been through the one path process to really not worry so much about the candidate's experience and education and allow folks to take the exam when they're ready. So I know that in Will's case, you took it pretty shortly after you took while you were still taking classes, as I recall.
Yeah, I took the exam in November and then I graduated with my undergrad in December.
Yeah, yeah, and that really wasn't possible before. So again, there are I think when some people talk to people that take the exam before, they took it under very different circumstances. Not only was it a different version of the exam, but they took it more at the part of their planning experience that maybe Aaron is a little bit more like yours, where people aren't taking the exam till they've been out of school. I mean, it used to be you couldn't even pick up the application for 2 years. So this is
Mhm.
really sort of a different thing. Not to skip too far ahead, but the stuff that you're going to be helping us out with today, um, this group of areas of practice is covers a number of things that a lot of planners don't necessarily specialize in. Things like hazard mitigation, parks, infrastructure, facilities. They're certainly part of the general planning task, but oftentimes these aren't things that people necessarily have an entire class about in school, or there's not 100% position devoted to them. And I mean this in the best possible way. These probably aren't things that you're particularly great at, but you still have to take care of them on the test. Do you sort of feel like some areas of the test and preparing for the exam that you sort of really have to reach for?
So I think there's some areas of the test, if I understand the question correctly, that I mean, you're not going to come into contact with those every day of practice if you're just a general, planning practitioner. But you're still going to have to find ways to study for that, and find materials that cover that, to make you feel prepared for those questions, because some of them are not necessarily, I mean, you have to know enough to understand the questions, but it's not something that you're necessarily familiar with in everyday practice, if unless you're
Yeah,
specialized.
I would agree with Aaron. The only thing I would add to that is just when you see all these different types of planning, pick out the one specifically that you can tell you have never seen before in your life, and then just get to know. a general framework and basic understanding of those types of plannings. And then if you want to be a little bit daring, you could go a little bit deeper into the research, but generally keep it vague. Just understand those main principles of that type of planning. That's normally what I did. It helped me a lot in just helping understand these general concepts and making connections between these type of planning to other types of planning.
I think it's a really good point. And sometimes just knowing that a thing is a thing will get you far enough along that you can, put whatever the question happens to be into some context or just have some basic level of recognition, even if maybe you don't fully understand it. Well, I really appreciate your sharing that, and I'm sure you'll have more as we go through this. So welcome, and let's start to talk about what this review is trying to do. This presentation is organized basically following the same outline as the certification exam content outline itself. Um, there are 9 major topics on the exam outline. If you haven't looked at it, you can find it over at planning.org somewhere. It looks like the picture on your screen. And then, so this is about one of those 9 major topics. It's actually even a part of one because areas of practice is in fact the largest area, at least by content on the outline. Although, as we'll mention, it's not necessarily the most number of questions. But hold on a second. The outline basically refers to subtopics, and then within those, there are a variety of identified keywords, of key terms and concepts. And in some cases, we've added some keywords and also some graphics and sample questions, really more as examples of learning approaches rather than as actual literal true or false planning material. So as we move through the presentation, our panelists will also help us out with maybe connecting some planning practice applications and real-world examples, test-taking strategies, which we've already hinted on, as well as useful resources and study tips. So this area of the exam, this section known as areas of practice, makes up about 12% of the questions on the exam, a total of roughly 18 out of 150 possible scored questions. The material identified on the content outline includes a total of 19 subtopics. Okay, so we've got 19 subtopics and 18 questions. That means that it's a little bit of a weird section. I sometimes say that this is not the most efficient section to study for because it's a very large section, and it is not the largest section of the exam, but as our panelists have said, you still got to answer all the questions. So, you might decide to sort of maybe prioritize it in a certain way, but it's still there. And so this presentation covers 6 out of those 19 subtopics. So hopefully you can use this presentation to identify your potential strengths and weaknesses, organize your study plan, and prioritize the order in which you want to do things. And again, that also, as Will pointed out, how much depth do you really want to add? And to a certain extent, every time you go deep, you might lose an opportunity to go broad. So you're going to need to think about how you want to balance that out. There's not really a best answer, but at least you sort of have an understanding of the total terrain. So in terms of the subtopics that are part of this that are part of this presentation, again, this is 6 out of 19 for Roman numeral 8 altogether. And so the things we'll be covering include natural resources planning, hazard mitigation and resiliency, infrastructure and service planning, parks, recreation and open space, sustainability, and resilience. And there are instances on the exam where they'll use the same word twice. So sometimes you have to say, all right, are they asking about resilience as it relates to sustainability, or are they asking about resilience as it relates maybe to hazards and natural disasters? And resiliency also pops up in economic development. It also pops up in food. It pops up in a number of places. So sometimes even though you see the same word twice, it doesn't mean the same thing every time. And then lastly, rounding out with facilities and services planning. So I have the pleasure of handing this off to Aaron, who will get us started with Section A, Natural Resources Planning.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Yin. So what we'll do is we'll just run through each of these terms. We'll define them, and then if we need to, we'll stop and we'll discuss them, as Dr. Yin had alluded to previously. So we'll kick it off with environmental assessment. Right, so environmental assessment, as defined here, is evaluating the environmental impacts of development projects, such as identifying potential environmental impacts, assessing the severity of those impacts, and developing strategies to mitigate negative impacts. These approaches support the protection and preservation of natural resources. This is an interesting term because this actually came up quite a bit in some form or another on the test when I took it in May. And not just environmental assessment, but it was referenced as an EA. So knowing the abbreviations of some of the terms because they don't always define those on the test. But related words, keywords and cross references, environmental impact analysis, environmental impact assessment, and National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA. Definitely be familiar with NEPA. That came up quite a bit as well.
Yeah, and that's a really great point, Aaron. That I mean, again, we talked a little bit about this before we started the tape rolling, which is there aren't actually any proper nouns, hardly any proper nouns on the outline, and sometimes you're sort of having to sort of do a dot to dot. And when you see something that is specific, like a question about NEPA, you sort of have to recognize it and say, oh, okay, well, the general topic this is about is environmental assessment. Because they're not going to ask you, like, what's Chapter 47, Section 3, Paragraph B of NEPA? They're going to ask you, what do you do, right?
Right.
Yeah,
Exactly.
I also had a lot of questions where it was just an acronym and you had to decipher what the acronym was just based on everything else. Uh, yeah, it can be a little bit hard if you don't use those acronyms on a daily.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But if the acronym had been different, if it had been like cheese, you'd have still like had to like think about, okay, what do I recognize this from?
Yes, and use context. Look at how it's being used in the sentence. Look at how it's, the words that are all adjacent to it in the sentence. And a lot of times, even if it's environmental assessment and they shorten it down to EA, you can use the context clues there to kind of pull you back into what they're looking for in that answer because you still have your multiple choice answers there. So one of those four are correct. So use the context. And if you've studied and you're familiar with it, you're going to be able to narrow it down. Um, all right.
That's such excellent advice.
Thank you. All right. Oh, we have a question. So this is an example where it shows us environmental assessment and it talks about NEPA identifies which of the following big questions that must be addressed in an environmental impact statement. And this kind of uses those keywords that we just talked about that are adjacent to EA. And here it gives you your options and your answer. So I definitely encourage everyone to dig in on some of these kind of example questions that are provided. Right. Two, climate impact and change. Environmental factors that impact natural resources and community development, such as sea level rise, extreme weather events, and changes in temperature and precipitation patterns. These factors are relevant to planning for the development of resilient and sustainable communities. Related keywords and cross references, mitigation, adaptation, retreat, resilience, and action plans. Right. Environmental impact analysis. As it's defined here, we see it's environmental impact analysis is the process of evaluating the environmental impacts of development projects on natural resources. This analysis includes identifying potential impacts, assessing the severity of those impacts, and developing strategies to mitigate negative impacts. Environmental impact analysis is a critical component of natural resource planning for planning because it supports the protection and preservation of natural resources and the creation of sustainable and resilient communities. I think it's going to be important to know when an environmental impact analysis is needed in the development timeline. I think that came up a couple of times, if I remember correctly, in some form or fashion on the test. So it wouldn't hurt just to glance over that in the study material. All right. Environmental justice. This is going to be fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all individuals and communities, regardless of race, ethnicity, income, or other characteristics in the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies that address and mitigates the disproportionate impact of environmental hazards and pollution on marginalized communities and promotes equity and access to environmental resources and benefits. Related keywords and cross-references, environmental racism, toxic waste, U.S. toxic release inventory with EPA. As a side note, just know what your different types of justices are on the test.
What do you mean by different types of justices? Ooh, I get to learn something.
Well, you have environmental justice, but then there's, I think we see this come up. Um, uh, Dr. Yen, you just put me on the spot
I'm
because I was.
sorry.
No, you're
You,
fine
no, do
because
you mean like do you mean also things like food security, or do you mean like racial equity, or
Yeah, like social justice.
yes, social justice, Lewis. For some reason, just a second.
okay, yeah, no, that would actually make sense. I mean, social justice is a specific plank within the AICP Code of Ethics, and I think sometimes that gets again a little bit confusing when the same term is used maybe used in different ways. Also,
And we may just need to
sometimes
take
what
that
you
out because I mean, like, we may need to take that out of the recording because, sorry, I know we're still rolling,
okay.
but for some reason, I thought this came up on the test, like environmental justice and name additional justice types of justice, justice practices, because that just like literally came into my mind. Um,
Um, yeah,
Will, do
I
you
don't
remember
know.
anything like social justice,
So
environmental
I didn't
justice?
really
I'm thinking there's four
have
types.
any, I didn't have any like justice-centered questions. I really had more of, it was really just a mixed bag of random stuff. It really was a lot of research methods, and then the rest were either like environmental, transportation, or economically rated like questions.
Okay.
Yeah, I have no idea. Well, Aaron,
Okay.
I'll sort of clip this out. Why don't we?
Please flip it out.
Yeah, no,
Oh,
that's
are we
fine.
still paused?
Well, I didn't pause
He didn't
because I
pause.
because they're still going to have to like mess with it anyways. But
Uh,
but but why don't you just take a deep breath and go into five as as if
Do
you
you
had
want me
just
to redo
ended
four?
four.
Do you want
What?
me to
okay.
redo four?
No, no, because there was sort of a hard stop there, and then I asked you a question that you didn't want to answer.
No, you're good.
It'll be fine. It'll be
And that's
fine.
also me, just like I should have had the answer in my head before I spouted something off.
No, no, it's
It's
no,
okay.
it's
It
quite all right.
happens.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, this is
All
just how
right.
it goes. All right, so sort of take a deep breath. I'll move us to five, and then just start whenever you feel like it.
All right. Number five, we're going to look at impacts to Indigenous communities. This is the assessment and consideration of the potential effects of natural resources, planning, and development on the land, resources, and cultural heritage of Indigenous communities, recognizing tribal sovereignty, unique relationships with natural environments, and reliance on natural resources for economic, social, and cultural well-being. Natural resources planning Natural resources planning accounts for the impacts on these communities and engage in meaningful consultation and collaboration. And adaptability. Ability of natural resource management and planning to respond to changing conditions and new challenges. Adaptability requires flexibility, resilience, and innovation in resource management practices to ensure the long term sustainability and health of natural systems and communities. Proactive climate protection, number seven. And as we see it here, this is going to be efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and mitigate the impact of climate change on natural resources and ecosystems that considers potential impacts of climate change on the environment and human communities and develop strategies to adapt and mitigate those impacts, including promoting sustainable land use practices, protecting and restoring ecosystems, and building resilient communities that can adapt to the changing climate.
So that gets us to the end of section A. But before we move on, that's a term that I'm pretty sure is new to this version of the exam. It might even be new enough that if you weren't in planning school very recently, you might not have gotten it. And I think there's even some cases where it might not be something that might be directly addressed in certain planning curriculums at the moment. Um, If it's something you didn't pick up in a class, like when you run into something on the outline that you, where do you get it from if you don't get it from sort of planning experience or planning school for the
Ooh,
test? Did you guys have any sort of, did you just start plugging stuff into Google and praying?
so I did do some of that, but for things like these things that like have to do with the environment, thankfully for me, I like to garden. So I was able to make a lot of meaningful like connections through gardening because
Oh,
once you like get into like this really deep dive and just keep going down the spiral of what gardening
mm.
can be is, you realize that it's a lot about if you want to be a good gardener, it's about protecting ecosystems and working with the landscape. So if you can find ways to incorporate your hobbies into the exam, that'd be very useful if they can relate to things like this.
That's a really good point. I also, I mean, to go off that one, for this type of topic, I would probably look at EPA. Um, they're going to have
Sure.
some information more than likely, it's topic specific. Just in general, I went to other state chapters' websites
Mhm.
because a lot of state chapters provide study material, and if you kind of pull all of that together, you get a pretty good, you know, cross section of material to work off of. Um,
To Aaron's point, the Florida APA and the Pennsylvania APA, they do a really good job of just creating like these online repositories of information that you can use for the AICP exam. It might be a little outdated, but outdated is better than nothing.
No, that's a really good point. And I think more generally, Aaron's point about a little bit of sort of getting outside of your comfort zone. I mean, Alabama, where we all are located, relatively speaking, although I know we work outside of these fields as well, though, how it approaches climate change issues is very different than, say, California would. So, there are some things where you sort of need, where if you go see what other people are doing, talk to people that work in other parts of the country, you might get a really different perspective that would sort of help you be more well-rounded in sort of how you approach this. Um,
and that's
so,
something
uh,
else.
yeah,
Oh,
please.
so that's something else to keep in mind is that everyone, all AICP planners in the, it's it's a national test. So it's not just the planners in your state or, that the planners that you associate with that are taking this test, or the planners that practice in ways similar to you. Um, it's you have to broaden how you approach things to a national level versus how you practice maybe just in your state. So kind of think about that when you begin studying.
Such a good piece of advice. Yeah, and other folks in this series have also really backed that up as well. Um,
Something more I'd like to
so
add.
yeah, please.
Um, when we come up with topics that we're not familiar with, we have a very useful resource outside of just Google. If you were to look up some of these like terms on YouTube, you could find like quick, short 5-minute videos that explain some of these topics to you. Again, it is YouTube and it is on the internet, so make sure you find reliable YouTube channels that are spreading good information.
Yeah, again, I think the overall purpose here is to identify, organize, and prioritize. And so, if you run into something that can be further explored, again, as Will was saying, with a little bit of a snippet here or there, that's a great time saver. And hopefully this will help some people, put some search terms into YouTube. Aaron's going to also move us through section B, hazard mitigation and resiliency planning.
Right. We're going to hit on some of the technical terms here, and we'll spend more time on those than some of the self-explanatory terms. I think we know what flooding and earthquakes and wildfires are, but we'll kind of hit on the more technical terms as we go through this. All right. First item, term number one, we have risk assessment. This is going to be the process of identifying and evaluating potential hazards and their potential impacts on a community to inform strategies for mitigating the impact of hazards such as natural disasters, industrial accidents, climate change, including identifying vulnerable populations and critical infrastructure, assessing potential economic impacts, and developing emergency response plans. Looking at some related keywords here: Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000, environmental impact analysis. We're seeing those EIAs again, environmental impact statement, and National Environmental Policy Act, so NEPA. As a side note, know the difference between environmental impact analysis and an environmental impact statement. Those are going to come up, or at least they did for me.
Aaron, could I add something?
Absolutely.
So for the EIS, if you're working on any federal project, you're very likely going to see this EIS. So if you see something that comes directly from the federal government and you see EIS, just know that is most likely going to be an environmental impact statement.
All right. So, two, flooding. Flooding is a hazard that can have significant impacts on community, including damage to buildings, infrastructure, and transportation systems, as well as loss of life and property. And planning mitigation strategies for flooding include land use planning, stormwater management, and building codes and standards that promote resilience. So look at your types of floods, your 25, 50, 100-year flood, National Flood Insurance Program, your flood insurance maps, flood mitigation strategies, and community rating system. And it's probably going to be a good idea to be familiar with those cross references there and how they impact your planning, planning and policy just at a local level. Right, wildfires. Wildfires are a hazard that can have significant impacts on community, including damage to buildings and infrastructure, loss of life and property, and disruption to transportation and communication systems. Mitigation strategies for wildfires include land use planning, zoning, building codes, and standards that promote resilience, as well as efforts to reduce fuel loads and promote fire-resistant landscaping. You're going to also want to look at wildfire-urban interface. Right. Spills. The accidental release of hazardous materials into the environment, such as oil, chemicals, or radioactive materials. Mitigation strategies for spills include land use planning, zoning, and building codes and standards that promote resilience, as well as emergency response plans and measures to prevent spills from occurring in the first place. Brownfields. Abandoned, idled, or underutilized industrial or commercial sites where the expansion, redevelopment, or reuse of the property may be complicated by the presence of hazardous substances, pollutants, or contaminants. Hazard mitigation and resiliency planning involves identifying and mitigating potential hazards associated with brownfield sites to protect public health and safety. On brownfields, I will say I would be able to identify what a brownfield is. If you're given, 3 different scenarios or 4 different scenarios, be able to pick out which scenario is the brownfield. So,
Yeah,
I
of
also
the
have a
relatively
brownfields
few,
question.
yeah, yeah, of the relatively few proper nouns on the content outline, this is one of them, and I think there's almost 100% chance that it would show up on the exam. So yeah, and again, as Aaron said, just know what it is. I mean, the situation could be a variety of situations, but sometimes it's just a matter of just sort of, okay, well, that's a thing, and that's probably a thing, and here it is. That's really helpful.
anti-terrorism. Developing strategies to prevent or mitigate the effects of terrorist attacks on communities, such as implementing physical security measures, developing emergency response plans, and coordinating with law enforcement agencies. Looking at cross references there, bollards, type of terrorism hazards, human-made hazards, such as explosives, chemicals, biologic, cyber, etc., explosives and hazardous materials, threat potential, vulnerable zones, security zones, risk assessment, etc. Disaster preparedness, identifying potential hazards and developing plans to reduce the impact of disasters on a community, including developing emergency response plans, coordinating with local agencies and first responders, and implementing measures to protect critical infrastructure. So disaster preparedness planning, hazard mitigation plans, pre-disaster plans, and post-disaster plans. I would say on some of these plans like this, it wouldn't hurt just for study materials, just Google and see what one of these plans looks like, because you're probably going to be more familiar with it if you've actually seen one, um, and glance through it than if you just memorize the definition. Right. Environmental justice planning. Ensuring that all individuals, regardless of race, ethnicity, or income, have equal access to the benefits of planning and are not disproportionately burdened by its negative impacts, including addressing environmental hazards that may impact low income and minority communities and ensuring that these communities have a voice in the planning process. Public health crisis. Public health crises can have significant impacts on community, including outbreaks of infectious diseases, food and waterborne illness, and exposure to hazardous chemicals. Hazard mitigation and resiliency planning involves identifying potential public health risk and developing plans to reduce their impact on community. Right. Adaptation. Developing strategies to prepare for and adapt to the impacts of climate change and other environmental hazards, such as measures for developing green infrastructure, improving building codes and standards, and incorporating climate change projections into planning and development decisions. Oh, Dr. Yin, your microphone is.
You guys are so nice calling me doctor. I just play one on TV. So that gets us to the end of section B, with adaptation. And it seems like you guys had, any one of these sections, there might only be, one question on the exam. Although it does seem like a lot like this is a section that intertwines with a lot of other things as well. It seems to
Yes.
really sort of bring up other, there's a lot of other issues that come up with it.
No, I would agree with that. And some of these terms run adjacent to other
Yeah.
other planning topics. So you could see some of these cross-referenced in maybe other subtopics.
Yeah, that's a
Like for
good point.
anti-terrorism, I guess we'll find out later ahead in the slides anyway, so I don't know why I'm saying this. Um, Anti-terrorism also does relate directly into facilities planning and like the services planning. Um, a good resource for anti-terrorism would be the United Facilities Code for the US, because that's the federal guidelines for all federal buildings, and it incorporates the standard guidelines for anti-terrorism.
Mhm.
No, that's a really good point. And again, maybe not being aware of a specific set of codes or standards, but knowing that that is something that planners sometimes apply and use around that. Again, sometimes just knowing that a thing is a thing. So that gets us to the end of section B on hazard mitigation and resiliency planning. Section C, infrastructure and service planning.
All right, so for section C, we have our key terms and concepts: concurrency, essential public and community facilities, service delivery, energy, adaptability, and life cycle analysis. Concurrency. Requirements for infrastructure and services to be in place or scheduled for construction before new development can occur to ensure that new development does not overwhelm the existing infrastructure and services, leading to traffic congestion, overcrowding, and other negative impacts. Infrastructure and services that are subject to concurrency may include roads, water supply, wastewater treatment, schools, parks, and emergency services. Essential public and community facilities. The physical infrastructure and services that are necessary for communities are able to function effectively and meet the health, safety, and well-being needs of the community, including hospitals, schools, fire stations, police stations, libraries, community centers, and parks. So here we have a map detailing essential public and community facilities. Can't really detail the maps, but I want to assume that you'll have things like your schools, libraries, any public meeting areas. Those would, I would assume, would be considered essential facilities for communities.
And do you mind, Bill, if I add a comment?
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Right. And Dr. Yin, your mic is off again. I don't know if you were trying to.
No, go
I
ahead,
was
Aaron. I think, yeah, please.
you could have a question like this that just shows you the map labeled community facilities, and it could say something of if you were to see a map like this, what type of facilities would be shown, and just kind of understanding that connection. Um, I don't know,
Right, because
just
a
some.
community might have 12 parks, but one hospital. So if you see 12 dots, it's not going to be hospitals.
Right.
Yeah, well, I was going to say when I was muted accidentally, this gets to your point about sometimes just go see if you can find it in a plan because
Mhm.
that might really help you how it's being deployed and what it is. I mean, that's sort of what you're trying to help us understand, right?
Right. Mhm.
All right.
That was it. Sorry.
No, that's great. Thanks.
This dog will not move.
Always happy to have more company.
So three, service delivery. The provisions of public services and programs to communities, including transportation services, healthcare, education, waste management, and other essential services in a manner that ensures the services are accessible, efficient, and meet the needs of the community. Four, energy. Energy planning refers to the development and implementation of strategies to ensure reliability and sustainable energy supplies for communities. In the context of infrastructure and service planning, for planning energy, planning may include the development of renewable energy sources, the integration of energy efficient technologies in buildings and infrastructure, and the establishment of energy conservation programs. Effective energy planning is crucial for reducing carbon emissions and ensuring the long-term sustainability of urban. You left us hanging, Dr. Yin.
Urban areas. Sure, why not?
Oh, for this, I want to just add a possible little acronym that would be LEED, LEED. Look up LEED, as that is very important to energy conservation and sustainability, especially for buildings. Five, adaptability. The ability of infrastructure and services to adjust to changing circumstances over time, including changing demographic trends, technological advancements, and environmental conditions by evaluating the environmental and economic impacts of infrastructure and services to ensure that the long-term needs of the community are met. So for our keywords and cross-references, we have blue infrastructure and green infrastructure. Blue would be those things relating to water, anything that has to do with the water cycle or water lifeline. And then we have green infrastructure, which again, we can kind of assume what it means, such as those renewable energy policies, things that have to do with sustainability.
Sounds good. So if you had a bingo card that just had the word adaptability on it, you would get like five in a row in this part of the exam, wouldn't you? Hasn't this come up like
Yes.
four times already?
I wonder how many times it's come up in the previous ones.
It comes up. It comes up. But yeah, knowing what winds up being important though. And lastly,
Six, life cycle analysis. Of life cycle analysis involves evaluating the environmental and economic impacts of infrastructure and services throughout their entire life cycle, from construction to decommissioning. Very important. We have to know how long can our systems live, and what will it take to maintain them at where they are, or will we have to do massive repairs in the long run?
so that gets us to the end of section C. To move into D, we'll hand it back to Aaron.
All right. Y'all are going to get tired of me for a second. All right. So with D, we're going to look at parks, recreation, and open space. And so I think a lot of us these are terms we're probably pretty familiar with, more so than maybe the environmental side, unless we're just, very interested in that. So we'll get started and go through these key terms. All right. This one's a mouthful. Health, wellness, livability, variety, programming, access to, and provision of natural and built spaces. Parks and open spaces are critical for promoting physical and mental health, enhancing the livability of communities, and supporting economic development. Effective parks and open space planning requires careful consideration of factors such as accessibility, diversity of programming, and the provision of experience with the natural and built environment. Looking at some cross references here, you're going to want to know what greenways are, parks and facility standards, trails, equity, and play deserts. Um, Once again, kind of a staple question. CAP parks, um, knowing some familiar terminology or adjacent terminology there. So parks that are built over segments of freeways. I think Boston has some examples
I
of this.
will say I did have this question on the exam.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
All right.
I think the last thing Aaron said was really interesting, which was, yeah, I think I've heard about that in Boston. So even if you didn't know A, B, and C, you'd be like, all right, well, I know that's a thing. I've never heard it called a cat park before, but maybe that's what it is.
Right.
I think that's a legitimate question solving strategy. I mean, I'm pretty sure I've done things like that because
Mm-hmm.
again, I mean, to Will's point, I I don't know that I've ever used the term cap parks outside of this slide.
I'll be honest, I used that strategy quite a bit on the exam because we
Okay.
use there's like the formal name for things, and then there's the things
Yeah,
that the names that we give, you know, the layman's terms that we use. And so I would probably use that strategy here.
Yeah, I think
Because
that's a really great piece of advice. There was a there was another person on another one of these who said something to the effect of that they remind people who are about to take the exam to tell them don't forget what you know and don't forget what you've seen. And I think sometimes you just like
that's
get
great
so
advice.
blind. Yeah, yeah. I think that's especially true for this kind of exam.
yes, right. Natural systems viability, the preservation and enhancement of natural features and ecological processes in parks, recreation, and open space planning, including the protection of natural resources such as water bodies, wildlife habitats, and wetlands, as well as the integration of natural systems into park designs using sustainable and resilient park systems that benefit both the environment and the community. Safety. Design and management of parks and other resources to minimize risks and hazards to visitors, such as ensuring adequate lighting, clear sight lines, and safe pedestrian and bicycle paths. Additionally, parks should have appropriate security measures such as surveillance cameras and park rangers to prevent crime and ensure the safety of visitors. Informal spaces. Areas within parks that are not designed for specific recreational activities, such as benches, picnic areas, and open lawns, that provide opportunities for relaxation, socializing, and passive recreation, while also enhancing the aesthetic and ecological value of parks and providing a buffer between more structured recreational areas and natural environments. I would also say this slide made me think, know the difference between a passive space and an active space when you talk about, your park recreation and open space. Right. Allowance of cultural practice. Parks, recreation, and open space planning should consider the cultural practices and traditions of the communities they serve. This may include providing spaces for cultural celebrations, such as festivals or religious ceremonies, or designing spaces that reflect the cultural heritage of the surrounding community. Allowing for cultural practices within parks can foster a sense of community and promote social cohesion. Right? Conservation versus preservation. There's probably gonna be a question on this on the exam. I feel like there was one on mine. Conservation aims to use natural resource sustainability, while preservation aims to protect natural resources from human use altogether. Conservation may involve activities such as harvesting timber or controlling invasive species, while preservation may involve limiting human access to sensitive natural areas. I'm looking at some cross references here: conservation easements, farmland preservation, open space preservation, transfer and purchase of development rights.
Yeah, I had farmland preservation and transfer and purchase of development rights questions on mine.
Mm-hmm. And knowing like what farmland preservation is a strategy is a farmland preservation is an example of what type of you know
I
strategy:
think
conservation versus preservation.
I think my farmland preservation question had to do with Portland, Oregon for some reason. Well, thanks.
Yeah, you have a good memory.
Yeah, and you're muted.
I know. Um, But you both raised good points, though, about not just this question, but some of the others in the same section. In Especially in that sometimes, conservation, preservation. I mean, they'll sound like nouns, but a lot of questions tend to be very procedural. Like, what's a step that you would take, or what would you do to do something? So remember, sometimes like this could be conserving versus preserving. So sometimes you have to think about it like as an applied concept as well. I think that was also that, and that also makes for a really easy kind of question, like what would you do? And those are fairly common question types on the exam, don't you think?
Yes.
Yes, a lot of scenarios,
Okay.
primarily scenarios.
Mhm. Also, just knowing those basic definitions and then using just your knowledge to understand, you know, how we utilize those definitions in practice
And
in
that's
the
been,
scenarios that we're given. Mhm.
yeah, no, and Aaron, you're exactly right. And that's been, I mean, a deliberate shift in in how the exam has been positioned. I would say over sort of the long term, maybe 10 to 15 years, it's really moved from one where there was a little bit more of a focus on memorization to one that is a little bit more situational about critical thinking. Again, if I think if you've taken the test recently, you wouldn't necessarily see that shift, but if you've sort of observed it, you would, come that way. And again, I think if you talk to sort of, I think when candidates talk to people that took the test maybe say 10 or 15 years ago, their experience was more sort of a memorization and a recitation. Whereas if for folks like you that did a little more recently, it's like, oh no, you have to know how to do things. You had to pick the best way or the most plannery way to do something. And I think that
Yeah,
just requires a slightly different mindset.
the way I like to put it is you're literally practicing your practice on this exam.
Oh, that's great. All right. Well, that gets us to the end of section D. Section E, sustainability and resilience planning.
So our key terms and concepts for this section will be harmony with nature, livable built environment, interwoven equity, resilient economy, healthy community, responsible regionalism, adaptability, again, and life cycle analysis, again.
And just a real quick note here that I think six or seven of these terms are actually directly from concepts developed in a planning advisory service report, the Sustaining Places report by David Gottschalk and David Rouse. So if you're looking for something that drills deep on all of these, I think this is taken directly from that. So we'll go to number one for you, Will.
All right. Harmony with nature. This principle ensures that natural resources contributions to human well-being are explicitly recognized and valued, and that maintaining their health is a primary objective. It involves protecting critical habitats, reducing carbon footprints, and integrating renewable energy. Plans should adopt sustainability standards, manage ecological systems, and prepare land use regulations to prioritize the health of natural systems. So some keywords and cross-references. We have natural resources, human well-being, ecological systems, habitat protection, carbon footprint, renewable energy, sustainability standards, land use regulations, environmental health, natural systems, and here we have the leads, so the leadership in energy and environmental design. Like I touched on before, that one would probably be key for a lot of the facilities. It's also architecture related. I know personally on my version of the exam, there was a lot of sustainability questions. Good bit of them had to do with habitat protection, sustainability standards, and land use regulations. Two, livable built environment. This principle ensures that all elements of the built environment include land use, transportation, housing, energy, and infrastructure. Work together to provide sustainable green places for living, working, and recreation with a high quality of life. It emphasizes mixed use development, walkable neighborhoods, green building standards, and efficient infrastructure use. So some of our keywords and cross references, land use again, transportation, housing, energy, infrastructure, mixed use development, walkability, walkable neighborhoods, green building, sustainability, quality of life, compact development, transit oriented development. Ooh, tongue twister towards the end. All right. Three, interwoven equity. This principle ensures fairness and equity in providing for the housing services, health, safety, and livelihood needs of all citizens and groups. It focuses on empowering neighborhoods, expanding access to healthy food, and promoting affordable housing and mixed income communities. Some keywords and cross references are fairness, equity, housing, services, health, safety, livelihood, empowerment, healthy food, and affordable housing. Again, we're going to see these terms a lot with sustainability. So it really is, how do these terms apply to all planning systems? That's literally how we're applying this. This is what makes it sustainable. 4, resilient economy. This principle ensures that the community is prepared to deal with both positive and negative changes in its economic health and to initiate sustainable urban development and redevelopment strategies that foster green business growth and build reliance on local assets. It involves promoting economic diversity, supporting local businesses, and planning for post-disaster recovery. Some of our keywords and cross-references include economic health, sustainable development, green business, local assets, economic diversity, local businesses, post-disaster recovery, redevelopment, and sustainability. 5, healthy community. This principle ensures that public health needs are recognized and addressed through provisions for healthy foods, physical activity, access to recreation, healthcare, environmental justice, and safe neighborhoods. It emphasizes access to nutritious food, community health, and the integration of health considerations into urban planning. So their keywords are public health, healthy foods, physical activity, recreation, healthcare, environmental justice, safe neighborhoods, and community health. 6, responsible regionalism. This principle ensures that all local proposals account for, connect with, and support the plans of adjacent jurisdictions and the surrounding region. It emphasizes coordination and the integration of policies, sustainable regional development, and the consideration of broader environmental and economic processes. Some of our keywords are coordination, integration, adjacent jurisdictions, regional development, jurisdictional cooperation, regional plans, functional, sectoral regional plans, smart growth, regional planning agencies, councils of governments, and metropolitan governments. I would also add the MPOs in there.
And I was, if you don't mind, Will,
Yeah, go ahead.
know about councils of government. I know those definitely came up about regionalism, and I think also MPOs and RPOs. To your point, those were definitely examples of responsible regionalism that came up on the exam. I mean, not just those, but I remember those items or those entities.
Surprised they didn't put housing on here for responsible regionalism.
I think it's addressed under a different section within that particular report that a lot of this is based on. But yeah, and I mean, that's a good planning point though, is that a lot, some systems are very regional. Housing markets are regional, labor markets are regional, transportation systems, service regions, not necessarily specific communities. So having that sort of in point, and I think it's also, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but you've both worked for a council of government. I mean, you both work for
Yes.
intergovernmental agencies, so you
We
know exactly what you're talking about, and so that is a very important perspective. And it's one also. I think the point though is a lot of planners, even if you don't work with one, you probably will work with one, and that's how it really comes up in a planning context, right?
yeah,
Absolutely. Every state in the U.S. has COGS, and so if you're in the continental, I mean, continental, if
Yeah,
you're in the U.S., you probably are covered by a COG, and they
that
serve
is
important functions. So when we talk about regionalism, you have to discuss COGS, but
Hogs are
also
just so fun.
but also you have to talk about MPOs, you have to talk about RPOs when you talk about transit or transportation. So it really just depends on what type of regionalism, what type of, what you're talking about. But there's a lot of different examples, but those are just some of the ones we encounter more often.
sure.
You know what
And
I'd love
probably
to see?
a good one to sort of have some alphabet soup to sort of remember what might fall into this category. That's a really good point.
We
I
love
would
alphabet
love to
soup.
see.
Sorry.
Yes. Oh, no, you're fine. I was just gonna say I'd love to see APA push for more support for COGS, especially considering we kind of need COGS to be stronger at the regional levels. A strong
Yeah, well,
COG.
Yeah.
can do a lot.
Well, they're advocating for it. It's on the test, right? What more could you ask for?
You know, so seven, adaptability. Adaptability in sustainability and resilience planning refers to the capacity of urban systems, all those systems I was talking about, and communities to adjust to changing conditions, including environmental, social, and economic shifts. It involves the ability to modify strategies, structures, and processes to better respond to new challenges and opportunities, ensuring long-term resilience and sustainability. Adaptable planning integrates flexibility, continuous learning, and proactive measures to anticipate and mitigate potential disruptions, fostering a dynamic and resilient urban environment that can thrive despite uncertainties. Keywords are here flexibility and resilience. If you're going to be sustainable and resilient, you have to be flexible. It really is just the truth of nature. You have to you have to bend. Eight, life cycle analysis. A life cycle analysis is a method evaluating the environmental impact of a product, service, or system throughout its entire life cycle, from production to disposal. In sustainability and resilience planning, life cycle analysis is used to develop and minimize the environmental impacts of policies, infrastructure, and development projects. This involves assessing the resource use, energy consumption, waste generation, and emissions associated with different stages of the life cycle, and identifying opportunities for improvement and optimize. So we have cradle to grave analysis, infrastructure, and performance standards. Big one would probably be performance standards here. Get to know what a performance standard is and how it relates to local government.
Do you want to give an example?
I don't work in local government, you know?
Well, but you pitch projects to local government.
Um, Let me clarify what I do at my job.
Okay. Well, no. I'm not going to put you on a spot, but a performance standard might be, a developer comes along and okay, what's the, estimated lifetime on this building, or what are the periodic, uh, how often does it have to be maintained? What's the expected service life, things to that. And in some cases, that could drive whether or not a building permit is issued. It could drive construction materials. That performance standards is really just however you define it, and then whether or not the proposal that's brought forward meets those standards. That's sort of what I was trying to sort of round down to be a little more specific about. Does that match your understanding?
Yes. Although for my type of planning, our performance standards are really just the project management standards. No actual like, hey, is this facility doing well?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So also from sort of more of a project management, current planning, type of phase. But it's sort of an implementation element, or something to that effect. So that gets us through section E. Moving on, actually, probably not a bad segue into section F, facility and services planning.
Here we have our key terms and concepts: siting, programs, shared use, implementation, state and federal facilities, local community facilities and institutional uses, needs assessments, a gap analysis, and equity considerations. Siting. The siting process ensures that facilities are easily accessible to the people they serve and minimize negative effects on the environment and community based on various factors such as accessibility, population density, land use, and environmental impact. Siting is very important for when you're going to put any building down. It also relates a lot of the cost. Two, programs. Programs for the community may include recreational, cultural, or educational programs, as well as related services such as healthcare or public transportation based on community needs. Existing resources and strategies Tim provide to improve service delivery. Three, shared use. Shared use facilities can increase access to resources and reduce the cost of providing services such as joint use of schools or community centers, co-location of health clinics, and shared transportations. So I have a very funny shared use story. So in North Dakota and South Dakota, Schools are shared use with the U.S. Army Reserve and the National Guard. So there will be schools that have armories built into them.
That's interesting. It's not surprising. I mean, in more, sparsely populated areas, they're also centrally located. So, that actually makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's
Those,
cost effective.
and they're at the core of it, they're both institutional in nature, um, depending on zoning codes. But
Oh,
Yeah,
right.
interesting
Yeah.
shared use.
Yeah.
But
Well,
you'll
that's
normally
that.
see a lot of oh, you're gonna say Dr.
Well,
Yen?
well, no, I was just going to say that's, you know, it might sound unusual, and frankly, that could be sort of unusual. But isn't that totally how like a planner would think, though? Like, all right, it fits the zoning code, it fits the service area, like who cares? It's a combination Taco Bell, Kentucky Fried Chicken. Fine by me.
It
It's very functional, right?
yeah, as long as it fits what's legally allowed, we're good. Just go down the list and approve. But yeah, for shared use, normally a lot of the federal facilities are shared use. A lot of your U.S. military facilities are shared use as well. So primarily federal and state buildings are shared use. Four, implementation. Executing and managing plans, policies, and projects to develop and maintain public infrastructure and services, including securing funding, coordinating with stakeholders, adhering to regulatory requirements, and overseeing construction and operational activities to ensure that the planned facilities and services are effectively delivered and meet the community's needs and relevant plans. Five, state and federal facilities. State and federal facilities may include courthouses, post office, military installations, and other facilities that may have both positive and negative impacts on local communities and are sometimes planned and operated in cooperation with local authorities in terms of the location, accessibility, and design of these facilities. Again, like I said, for shared use between the schools and the U.S. Army Reserve National Guard, that's a state and federal shared use. Six, local community facilities and institutional uses. Local community facilities and institutional uses refer to buildings and infrastructure that are owned or operated by local government or non-governmental organizations such as schools, libraries, parks, and community centers that provide essential services and amenities to residents and may also serve as gathering places for the community. Seven, needs assessment. Evaluating the demand and supply of various types of facilities and services in the community, including analyzing demographic and economic data, conducting surveys or focus groups, and consulting with community stakeholders to inform decisions about the location, design, and programming of facilities and services in the community. Eight, gap analysis. Analysis of the existing supply of facilities or services versus the needs of the community. Facility and service gaps can occur due to the variety of factors, such as changes in population, shifts in economic activity, or inadequate planning or investments in the past. Identifying and addressing deficiencies help ensure that residents have access to adequate facilities and services. Nine, equity considerations. Addressing social and economic fairness in the decision-making process of locating and providing facilities and services to communities serves to ensure that vulnerable populations have access to critical services and resources, regardless of their social economic status, race, or ethnicity.
I know you're about to tell me I was muted.
No,
And
I was just going to let
and
you find out.
yeah, that's okay. So some things might fall in this category. Not exactly a food desert, but you've heard the term hospital deserts recently, and things to that effect, where populations are underserved. And again, sometimes on a test situation, a specific term, almost a pop culture term, could be fair game, could show up, but sometimes thinking about a solution or how you might relate it back to sort of a larger planning idea is sort of the purpose of integrating sort of your knowledge and skills with the content outline to recognize that you may recognize what a food desert is, but you never really thought of it in terms of equity or how that could be a failing of services planning or something to that effect. And that really helps to sort of build those bridges. So that brings us to the end of the content for this major section. Takeaways for this portion. Hopefully, you've had a chance to identify some knowledge gaps. You can think about how to organize a study plan using additional resources. We'll double back on that in just a second. And prioritize study targets by section and by topic, understanding that particularly in this area, on average, there might be maybe one question associated with each of these 6 major topic areas, which is a little bit less dense, a little bit less target rich than some of the other sections that are available. And thank you to our panelists for pulling this together. Boy, you guys made it sound a lot less random than I think it is. You guys are really drawing connections between different things, and here's a little bit of this, a little bit of that. But looking on this, when the content area is something that again a planner might be exposed to, but it's not sort of a principal position. What do you think are some sort of keys here to really prepare for that type of the content on the exam? The stuff that's relevant, but not necessarily a focus of a usual experience or position. Did you guys have any thoughts on that?
So for me, I looked at like, you have your outline, you have your study guide. I think you have to look broadly at that, know your strengths and your weaknesses,
Hmm.
what you're familiar with and what you're not as familiar with. And those topics that you're not as familiar with, you're going to have to spend some time studying on those and get more familiar with those topics and dig deeper into the material there, because those are probably going to be the questions that are more difficult to answer. That's kind of how one of my strategies that I used when I studied, and it did pay off in the long term.
I think that's really
Yeah,
good
I would agree with
advice.
Aaron. I definitely
Yeah.
agree. If I hadn't spent time on some of my weaker areas, um, I don't know how it would have gone, honestly. It's this exam is just that large. It's hard because it's so vast on what they can ask you about, and not having like a strict guideline makes it even harder. Because one of the bigger things I had to do was I boiled down a lot of things to fundamentals and concepts, and then just started to see how can I best find a way to interrelate two different topics so I could make these connections so that they stuck more. Because the more connections I made, the more likely I would remember it because I know this could also apply to a different area of planning.
And Will, to your point, I think that's one of the challenges of the test itself is that there's 150 questions, but the study topics or the knowledge base is so broad that you have to kind of know yourself to know what you have a good understanding of versus what you need to dig in on to better be prepared for the test. Um, and also just kind of know where your resources are.
For
Yeah,
someone who,
yeah, go on, Will.
I was going to say, for someone who wants more of like, how long would it take me to study for the exam? I studied for 8 hours every week. So if you want to do that, by all means do it. I know I passed, so there's a good chance you might pass. But notice how I'm saying might. It really is. You have to study a lot for it. You really have to allot this time where you're going to sit down, even if it's 5, 10 minutes. You need to study.
And I agree with that. And I guess I was in a little bit of a different situation than Will because I've been practicing for I'm gonna say about 8 years when I took the test,
Yeah.
which is kind of crazy. But even at that point, you still have to study. I mean, I studied, oh man, very intensely for a month and a half where I didn't do anything but study, but I studied probably for about a 3 month period before that, just on and off. And with that being said, it's still because you do once you get on up in your career, you know what you practice. But you have these other areas that you really don't touch that often. And those are the things that you're going to have to dig into because you need a refresher. But it's know that there's going to be areas that you're not as familiar with that you need to study and refresh on.
Yeah, treat everything as new. Be curious about all the content. That's my biggest advice. Because if you don't treat it as something new and exciting, this is going to be the most long, arduous test and study period of your life.
Yes, and another tip that I have is use tools. There are tools out there now. There's apps like study apps. I used Quizlet because there's younger people in my office that showed me these amazing things that can just help the process, help you study better and retain that information. And I mean, obviously, you still have to find the information. You have to put the information in, but it's going to be on your phone when you have a lunch break. You can start studying. You don't have to write out all the note cards necessarily. But there's tools out there that have made this process easier than maybe it would have been, 5 years ago.
I do recommend YouTube a lot. Like
Mhm.
even just basic YouTube like videos, like anything from a crash course series. Like they have a whole mini series on just the basics of economics. Even that by itself is great because all the videos are like 10 minutes long. You can watch one a day and learn about the general basic functions and principles of economics and have that ready to go for the exam. Just make those key connections. And I have more than just economics. So shout out
And
to Crash Course.
And I agree with that. I would find this series of videos, the one that we're currently working on, the APA has done, and I would put them on while I was cooking dinner. And anytime you can find a little bit of time to soak in additional information, it's going to be worth it. And then those things that you pick up that you're like, I'm not familiar with that. I need to jot that down and come back to it and study on that. It helps. I mean, every little bit of time that you can invest in studying helps. Um,
That's all such great advice from both of you. And again, I think you've heard me say that I think one of the and it's just interesting to hear like the different approaches you've both taken. Again, for some people, that might be exactly what works for them. For other people, I think just be inspired by it. Like you're gonna have to figure out what works for you, whatever that is. And different things work for different people, and hopefully you sort of know yourself. And you can figure that out. But I think the thing that both of you have heard me say in the past is when you actually get ready to sit down and take the test, you just have to be ready to pull from a lot of information at your fingertips in 3 hours. It's just plain hard to do. And everybody's gonna get for it a different way. But if you don't walk in there ready to pull out everything, including the kitchen sink, it's probably not going to be a successful attempt.
I agree with
There will
that.
be some crying. There will be crying, I assure you.
Now,
You will cry
okay,
during
don't
the
say
exam.
that. Now you're just scaring people off. But
Don't be
okay,
scared. Don't be scared to take it.
They're not tears of scared. They're tears of just joy.
yeah. All right. Well, thank you to our panel for their experience and their being so forthcoming about the test taking process. Again, Luis Will Balderrama, AICP, Aaron Tidwell, AICP, both test takers and new AICP members within the current cycle. So hopefully you're able to use this material to identify your knowledge gaps, organize a study plan, and prioritize those study targets. If you're watching this on YouTube and this has been useful to you, give us a like and feel free to share your feedback in the comments. Check out the APA website, as our guests mentioned, for more information on AICP OnePath, as well as links to additional member resources, including how to make contact with your local chapter or section, links to other exam prep review materials, as well as online member resources from APA and AICP. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Thank you very much.